And we're live.
Awesome. Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Scott Cohen from AGP Ventures in Boston, along with David Yahid, based in Renana, Israel. And welcome to our latest edition of AGP Access, which is our series aimed at connecting Israeli entrepreneurs to the US market. And thanks, by the way, before we start, to our friends at Retech, the Retail Tech Innovation Hub in Israel, for their support and help in pulling this together. So by way of introduction, if you don't know AGP, we're an early stage venture capital firm. We invest exclusively in Israeli startups. We have offices in Boston and Tel Aviv, and our mission is really to connect Israeli founders to the US market. And one of the ways we do that is through interactive forums like this. And we're honored to have an amazing guest this week in Mark Nitkey, the Global Innovation and Design Executive and friend of AGP, who was most recently the head of store design at Amazon Fresh. And like, Mark's bio is like way too long and impressive to try to go through it here. But like, suffice to say, he's an expert on retail and has held senior global store design positions at The Gap, at United Retail, at Victoria's Secret, at Apple, where he was the head of store design and led their store design creative lab, at Banana Republic, at Ahold, at CVS Health, and most recently at Amazon Fresh, where he was head of store design, development, and facilities. So just basically an amazing array of experience at some of the kind of biggest and most well-respected retail brands in the world, and also just a good guy on top of all that. So Mark, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Scott. It's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody for being on the call. I know it's late evening over where you are. And so appreciate you guys taking the time and for us to have this dialogue. I'm excited about speaking about retail.
Us too. So folks, like, first of all, we run a very informal shop here. So David and I are probably going to kick off some questions to Mark, but our goal is really to get your questions answered. So pop them in the chat or text us and we'll do what we can to get your questions posed. So Mark, maybe let me just kick this off, which is that you've done like a lot in your career. So like, tell us about your last role at Amazon Fresh.
Sure. So at the time I was at CVS Health with no intent to going anywhere else, and received a call from Amazon. They wanted to bring me on board for a confidential business proposition that I had no idea of what I was going to be doing when I got there. And they coerced me. It was a new business venture. And so basically they brought me in with a handful of other executives, a leadership team, to launch basically a grocery business for Amazon bricks and mortar. Obviously they had Amazon Fresh for several years as an online business. But as we know, grocery is a $3 trillion business in the US. So there's a lot of runway there. And so we basically started the business, ramped up the business. We created the overall strategy, the business plan. We developed, which Amazon does, a 10-year, 5-year, and 3-year plan, growth plan strategy. Everything we do at Amazon from a new business venture, a startup basically within Amazon. Amazon's very vertically integrated with all their businesses, so they don't slow down businesses. It's truly a startup mentality. And so we basically created the business cases. Well, Amazon's famous for doing PR FAQs, which is an interesting way to launch or at least get funded for your business, which is, what does the future state look like? What does the PR announcement look like when you go live, and what will customers think, feel, etc.? And then you tie that along in with the business case as well as where all the challenges are going to be. And so we launched the business. The leadership team heavily involved across all aspects of the business, from not only the technology we were going to look into, which, Amazon Fresh is a broad appeal grocer, but we had to have differentiators in Amazon fashion. That was the tech. And so we quickly evaluated and did PR FAQs on that tech and what kind of tech do we want in the store. And it was basically a plethora of tech. So we had traditional, especially from a customer standpoint. We developed Alexa in-store navigation specifically for Fresh. We developed obviously the traditional checkout, but then self-checkout. We incorporated credit card, palm read. We developed dash carts, which are basically you can drop anything into your cart and walk out the store, as well as a lot of you probably know, JWO, which is just walk out technology, which is different than the dash cart. So a lot of different customer propositions and customer experience from a tech standpoint. And so we built that business over the last 4 years. We ended up launching, we built about 60 stores. We launched 44 stores. And then recently we decided to slow the business down to get it truly right, which is interesting about Amazon. And so I'll kind of preface, pull in a little bit of my history, but different businesses, as we know, like to create and move differently. My two kind of opposite extreme examples are Apple, who, working with Steve, wants everything perfect before you push it out to the customer. And then, of course, you learn and you improve it. Amazon is quite the opposite. Amazon is, let's understand what future state is, push it out there as fast as we can get it out there, and then learn from the customer and tweak along the way. And so it's really Amazon in general is a startup mentality, and Amazon Fresh was very much that way. So in a nutshell, that's what it was. But we had a lot of learnings along the way, which, as we continue this dialogue this morning, I can share some of those things and maybe where some of the opportunities for some of you folks out there might be within the retail industry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, Mark, you've done, across a lot of different stores, not just Amazon and Apple and all these different ones. Before we kind of dig into the nitty gritty, can you kind of give us like the big picture insight of like where is retail headed?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time, frankly, and a lot of it's driven by tech, but I think a lot of it is going to be driven by. I would say there's 5 to 6 main drivers for retail. I think, and the three of us talked about it before, frictionless everything. And it's not just about being frictionless for the customer, it's about being frictionless for operations. And we can touch on some of the cool stuff out there, like Toshiba's doing a Pop Pay facial recognition payment system. Obviously, Amazon Fresh and Amazon has multiple options for customers. Other technologies across retail, like Samsung and Texel in London, are developing smart mirrors, going above and beyond what the smart mirrors today have. And then everybody's heard about the AI in drive-thrus in fast food. But I do think that seamless, kind of frictionless everything, operationally as well, there's a lot of huge challenges that retail businesses have around operations and how tech might make that omni-channel experience for the customer and within their operational structure more fluent and efficient. And I think that's where a lot of people they skim over that. Everything's focused on the customer, but if you don't make the operational side of the business both strategic and effective and efficient, you can't address the customer. There's some cool stuff out there. So I do think frictionless everything. I think embracing the experience economy is going to be huge for retail. And I think part of that, and we can talk about a little bit, is this idea of businesses creating experiences for their customers. And how does that tie into their own ecosystems versus depending on 3Ps to do a lot of the work that 3Ps are doing now. And so we can talk about what are some of those examples, whether it's medical services, whether it's retailers, how are they connecting with customers? And then touching on that is what could future state experience be? And I think Web3, the metaverse, are going to tie into that. I think that's a long pole, and that's, they'll start to tie in, but I think there's just a lot of hurdles around Web3 and metaverse currently. But I think way out there, future state, that's going to be a driver. Reimagining retail environments, formats are changing. I think a lot of back of house automation and technology needs to occur. for formats to be effective and efficient for their customers. Healthcare, I think, is a big automated virtual doctor appointments, pharmaceutical disbursement, distribution to customers, I think is going to be huge in the future. And then, sustainability in the circular economy. I think they say by 2025, 75% of retailers are going to make huge changes in their supply chains to improve, obviously, carbon emissions, other environmental factors, and production across retail categories, especially apparel, furniture, those sorts of things. The idea of made to be made again is gonna come into play. Even the luxury brands are delving into that now. And so AI, I think a lot of IoT work around how to get there is going to be important. And there's some cool companies out there. I think you've probably heard of Notco, which basically developed a bunch of AI and algorithms to learn how to combine an infinite amount of combination of plants to replicate flavor and texture of animal products without compromising on taste, et cetera, et cetera. That's opinion based, but and IKEA, circular economy within their production lines moving forward. I think the fifth one obviously is around AI, robotics, and analytics, but as it relates to personalization and curation and operations. So those three, curation and personalization kind of go together, but I think those are huge opportunities, and we can talk about where some of those might lie and some of the cool things that are happening now. So I think those are kind of the five big factors. I think within those opportunities, especially around digital and AI and robotics, I do think this idea of the traditional pipeline model has been kind of upended in recent years, right, by platform models such as Alibaba, Amazon, of course, Mercado Libre. All of those platforms facilitate interactions between sellers and users, but not a connection to the company they're buying from. And so I do think we're going to see a shift from those larger platform models to ecosystems within companies, so they can start to own that again, because I think a lot of retailers have lost that with these 3P sellers and users and buyers. So, but I'll open it up to any other thoughts, questions.
Can I ask a follow-up? The first bullet you were talking about was frictionless commerce, and you mentioned specifically frictionless operations. And I think, as you and I have talked, we see a lot of startups in Israel that are dealing with supply chain issues, but it's typically like tracking ships and like a kind of IP around supply chain over vast distances. When you think about frictionless operations, is that the kind of thing you're thinking about, or are you talking about in store? How do you what are you thinking about when you talk about frictionless operations?
Yeah, supply chain, larger, broader supply chain, as you just mentioned, is critical, right? But I think to get there and to address that bigger issue, it's basically in-store operations. So you think about even things from, I'll think about grocery and restaurants, food safety to inventory management. And when I say inventory management, it's really around inventory control, like real-time inventory control. So, these systems that tie into supply chain or tie into replenishment systems basically can be real-time in-store, in location. So a great, and how do you automate that? A great example is Amazon is a master at online, right? Across any kind of distribution. When we started to delve into physical locations and physical stores, which that's what we call the retail end, the physical store retail end at Amazon, understanding what the physical locations need, not only from a development standpoint, but from an inventory management standpoint. So knowing what's on the shelf and what's missing from the shelf almost immediately. And there is some cool tech out there already that's doing that. And then, even food safety, like Chick-fil-A built an IoT system, which is pretty phenomenal. They used a combination of 3D cameras, edge computing, advanced analytics to monitor their hot food for freshness, right? And then they would be notified when it's time to throw that food out. And they did that in a bunch of different ways. They built an NLP powered AI application to monitor social media for mentions of food poisoning, right? So they created this system where they could monitor where people were complaining about either feeling sick or the food tasted bad or rotten or whatever it is. And then they tied that into their IoT platform, and then all that data dump downloaded into their devices across the restaurants, right? And then it automatically flowed into their data lake for example, for querying, reporting, and downstream analytics workload. So, that whole idea of, that addressed food safety risk, a shrink from a food standpoint. Likewise with other retailers, like knowing what they sold immediately and how to replenish that quickly, then that impacts the downstream larger supply chain, get it over on boats or on planes or whatever you need to do. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with those in-store analytics and basically those workloads that aren't necessarily being addressed. So for example, Amazon's distribution system, if we think about it, is a push system, right? So customers order online. The distribution centers know, they're notified, what's sold, what they need to push out. And that was similar with grocery. So it was an online grocer, it's a push out. You also need a pull system where the stores, somebody in the store can actually step in and order versus it always being automated through this push system, because things could be off the shelf and the push system wouldn't know it yet because the downloads are happening, whatever, every 2 days, 1 day, whatever, or every week. And then, so you need this, not only a push system from a IoT standpoint, but a pull system that allows individual operators to control their inventory. So I think that's going to be important in the future, especially for any kind of apparel retailer. Food, obviously, it's going to be important that they know exactly what's hanging on the rack or on the shelf in real time, and then they can address that. I mean, everybody's heard, right, during COVID, the supply chain issues, like companies are trying to figure out their inventory. They're overloaded. They got to store it in warehouses. They decided not to put a lot of stuff on sale and save it for next year, right? And so if they had, pre-knowledge of those types of systems and how they were going to be impacted, they might have been able to react a little bit differently.
So, Mark, I've got a couple of questions that just came in around, I guess the categories like buy versus build, and not Amazon specific, because you probably can't talk about this because you just left there. But from your experience at all these different kind of retail brands, is there a general desire for them to build internally, or is there a willingness to partner with, startups to help them solve some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think that, the larger, obviously the Amazons of the world and the Alibabas, they like to build their own. But with that said, what Amazon also does and large companies do is they buy smaller businesses, right? Like Ring and all of those things. And they, develop, those businesses kind of run separately, but then they develop and build off of those. I do think, if you think about like even the AI drive-throughs at I think Carl's Jr.'s and Hardee's, like that's a Presto AI. So that's a 3P AI that they pulled in. I think most retailers, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the bandwidth, and they certainly don't have the resource allocation in-house to build those things. So I do think there's huge opportunity for startups and 3Ps to either supply or sell their technology to these. Eye tracking within retail is huge now. That's pretty much all 3P supplied. So those types of things, retailers would much prefer to have it external, so they don't have that overhead, right?
Right.
Is it because they don't want it to kind of invest in like the R&D and like building it, or is it because kind of outside sources come and say we could do this better? Because in industry there's a general kind of thing, we've always done it this way, so we'll keep doing it this way because it works, versus someone from the outside perspective saying, I have a fresh new take on this.
And that's exactly right. I think, Dave, you hit on both. I think the other aspect to it is retailers, especially now, are just they're cash strapped. They need to invest in kind of the basics of their business, and they don't have the capital to invest in those things that are more long term, right? And so those are long poles for them, where they would have to find the resources, they'd have to find the capital for it. And frankly, and depending what business you're in, groceries at 2 to 3% margin. Obviously, apparel is anywhere from 40% to 70%, which gives them a little bit more room. But most retailers are not willing to invest in it internally.
Mark, you at the start, you also mentioned the importance of the trend around the experience economy. There's a question here about basically asking for an example. Are there other examples of the experience economy you've seen that retailers have done or played with that you think are kind of interesting or cutting edge or effective?
Yeah, I mean, one that stands out, I love it, is Nestle, right? So Nestle owns Purina pet brand, and during the pandemic, they wanted to go out and get data about all the people who were buying puppies, right? Because there was an explosion of people buying puppies throughout the pandemic. And so they actually started an experiential marketplace where people could find puppy trainers, take classes over Zoom through their pet brands. And what was interesting about it is while the platform was hugely successful, they didn't monetize it at all. All the money went directly to the trainers, et cetera, et cetera. But within that, Nestle got data on millions of Americans who bought puppies, right? And for them, building that community was worth so much more than trying to monetize it. So that marketplace obviously leads to sales, but they realized, look, if we start, taking money away from the people who are training and doing these other things to build the business, it wouldn't be a good thing. And so I think companies understand. I mean, Lululemon offers free yoga classes. Michael's, the craft stores throughout the U.S. They basically they're embracing this next generation of retail through experiences and platforms. They have craft, similar. They have teachers that teach crafts. I do think the experience economy, especially around medical services, I mean, the push for virtual appointments, right? Virtual doctor appointments, pharma distribution. There's a lot of cool startups out there now that are doing, pharmaceutical or virtual doctor pods that they could drop in a location. They're HIPAA secure. They're secure. They actually have automated distribution of, if you're in the meeting with your virtual doctor, they have scales in there. They have blood pressure machines. They have everything in there that would be needed at the end of your appointment. They actually can distribute right there in the pod your prescription. And I think those things, especially around medical services, is huge. I mean, with CVS, we were exploring, how to bring in optometry, audiology, minute clinics, but all of these other types of services. And the issue has always been the capital to invest in the technology and the capital to build them doesn't allow some of those small margin businesses, pharmaceuticals, not small margin, but the actual front store is, to do it. And so these companies that are coming up with these new, not only, technology, but, actual pods or small buildings, I think is going to be critical. And so that, those are a few great, different examples. But even things about using Siri or Alexa or Google to interact, and then the learnings, the AI you can get from that interaction, right, around their customer needs, locations, location tracking, obviously is huge within stores. So retailers understand where people really shopping our store and where they're not shopping our store. So those are a few examples, if those help.
Cool. Can you talk about any opportunities you see in the kind of the post-order market? I've got someone who's asking a question about your thoughts on, returns, tracking, pickup, haul away, install, like that market. Is that, there's some things that Amazon does really well and are relevant there. There are other things like for, Wayfair, where there's like, for example, furniture, either to be hauled away or put together. Is there a kind of market or opportunity there in that space, you think?
Yeah, I do think there is opportunity there. I think a few things. So delivery is tough. Like nobody makes money on delivery. They lose money on delivery, frankly, in most cases. And returns kill a business. And so you'll see a lot of businesses. Wayfair has always charged to return things, but I think the tracking of those, and to me, like the opportunity is if somebody's returning an item, no matter how big or how small, does it need to go back to the business, get reloaded and into their distribution center, or can that identical product go to somebody else who just ordered it, right? And so I think there's a lot of technology around that, and opportunity around that as well. I do think, and this is where I mentioned the bringing things within companies' ecosystems. Where is the balance going to be in what the company owns and brings on board versus what they have 3Ps doing? So if you think about sustainability, the circular economy, like even IKEA is figuring out ways that their furniture can get reused and reshipped to people. I think this whole notion of delivery, inventory management, through one of the big challenges with all physical retailers that are out there is their back of house systems are antiquated. But how do you build robotic systems and smart systems within small retail back of houses that are tied into those omni-channel lines, right? So if you're in store, you're managing your inventory, somebody's ordering something online, where do you get it from, right? So do you get it, which is what pickup in groceries started to be, right? Why do we have these other locations? Let's use our grocery stores to deliver within zip codes that's more effective. The last mile is the most expensive for any retailer to deliver. And so figuring out a way through inventory management or inventory accessibility and insight or sightline to inventory to where best to ship from, I think is going to be critical. Because right now, virtually everything that's shipped is shipped out of warehouses, distribution centers versus stores, right? And so I think that's where a lot of opportunity is, if they can start shipping directly from stores.
Interesting. So I've got a question here that came in around your opinion on immersive commerce. You kind of mentioned AR, VR. So it seems like metaverse has kind of lost a little momentum, maybe because of ChatGPT. Like, what's your thoughts, opinion, and any thoughts on like adoption rate and when that becomes real?
Yeah, I think there's going to be, well, obviously there's challenges already, right? And I think, there might be some government controls put in place. I think it's going to be a combination. I mean, if you think about Web3, right, it's basically, a vision of a decentralized community, an open web with greater utility for users. I think until they figure out the security issues, which are vast, it's going to be slow in coming. I mean, the cons of kind of Web3 and metaverse, right, or the reliance on like NFTs and blockchain, which might be great in the future, but they're significantly complex, right, for the average user. And so I do think like if there are opportunities from a technology standpoint, how do you simplify kind of Web3 metaverse interaction. Because I think right now it's too complex for the average user, and the security issue. So I think it's years off from actually being adopted into physical retail.
Just on that topic, I mean, there's e-commerce and there's retail, and then how do you see is the metaverse considered one or the other, or is this like this whole new third entity?
I think it's a whole new third entity.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it'll pull from
Both sides.
from both sides. Yeah.
Interesting.
Mark, I hope you don't mind. We're going to technology specific questions, but I've got like two questions here on like Chat GPT. And one guy basically saying like, look, we know Chat GPT like functionality is going to hit e-commerce sites eventually. Which is, it seems that will probably make the traditional like browse experience through a catalog relatively, I don't know, maybe irrelevant. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on like what the future of commerce might look like. Is Chat GPT going to play a role?
Yes, obviously, I think it will. I do think that with ChatGPT, what'll become more important, and we touched on it earlier, is this real experience along with ChatGPT. I think the chat element is going to make ordering, it's going to make them understanding what you want and what you need faster, and it's going to continually improve. I mean, the AI that's in drive-thrus right now, some people are like, oh my God, they screwed up my order and I couldn't fix it, right? Like in order, I tried to fix it and I got 9 more iced teas than I wanted. And so, but that's part of the, that's part of the learning curve, right? But I do think it's going to speed up, it's going to ease customer interaction online, but I think it's going to actually invoke people to want to go to physical locations more to deal with people, right? And we might say, oh, but there's going to be fewer people in the store. And yes, there will be, but I think they'll be able to be more focused on the customer and less on the operational quotient in the store. So as technology in stores improve, right, people have to spend less time in those. And I do think, so that's another aspect of this, technology, what we kind of lack or don't think much about. Like we think about all these fun things like smart mirrors and digital mannequins and QR codes. But what we haven't thought through is, what are those processes and tools and systems that retailers are using that can get drastically simplified, right? And I think that's where even AI, and even if it's less than that, can drive some huge improvements in efficiency in store, and then you get more of a focus on the customer. I do think nobody does true omni-channel well yet. If you think about like your online experience and your in-store experience, and every brand is different. And so I do think, like, to me, that's the connection. Like, how do you use chat and online experience and really make it seamless in your store or out of your store?
If you had to predict, if you had to predict who you think is going to do omnichannel well, I mean, do you have any like guesses on brands that you think would be who are kind of poised well to do that?
I think frankly, I think some of the luxury brands are poised to do it well. I think I think their customer base is one of experience, but also one with a really low tolerance level. And so they have to get it right, and I think they'll get it right sooner. And they want that experience. They want that experience in both arenas, or they won't be successful, because they do want to drive people into their stores for that kind of exclusive experience. And what we've seen is, even with people who aren't, I'll say, consistent luxury buyers who might not have the income for it, they might love one product from a luxury retailer and always go back for that type of product. And I do think so. I think they have an opportunity. Their margins are huge. They're going into other avenues. We talked a little bit about it before, but some of these luxury retailers are going into travel. They're buying, rail, trains, planes, cruise lines, and so that connection, obviously, and that's where I think that the chat and the AI really come in to play. Is it'll truly let them understand what their customers' wants and needs are, more so than you talk to somebody over the phone, it doesn't get registered, right? You talk to a chat and it's all it's all getting disseminated, and historical data will be there forever, pretty much.
What are your thoughts about like some of the social aspects of shopping? We've talked before that in the Far East, it seems like group shopping and live streaming it's like a thing. I don't know if it's really picked up here. I mean, do you expect that to creep west at some point and become a broader trend?
I think so. I think group shopping, there's some of it in the U.S. It hasn't caught on. There are small groups that do it. Even, I mean, some of the, if you think about Groupon and some of those other arenas, they're still, they're not highly used. And again, I think, U.S. customers are a little bit different because there's not a lot of tolerance for waiting, right? And so, would you wait until X number of people join the buy to get a better price, or do you want it now? And so I think that part of it is culturally in the U.S. I think it's a little bit more challenging. I don't think it's going away. I just don't know if it's going to be a significant group shop is going to be a significant element of purchasing in the U.S. But that's one man's opinion.
Right. So I just got a really interesting question via text related to health and healthcare, and maybe putting back your CVS Health hat on. So the question says that you mentioned earlier kind of virtual doctor visits and pods, and I guess the question is asking like what could be done regarding some of the things you've learned about retail to drive better care in the home, and how can retail tech solutions be used to bring care to patients instead of bringing patients to care?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is one we talked a lot about at CVS. I think where it probably needs to start, and I do think like CVS's acquisition of Aetna and some of these other businesses, Walmart, basically owning their own pharmaceutical company, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's where the leverage is going to lie. The difficulty with some of those kind of virtual systems is just the HIPAA compliance and the privacy aspects of it. But I do think it's going to take some larger businesses to move heavily into virtual care, basically, right? And then, so yeah, it's always the HIPAA question. But bringing the customer to the care versus the care to the customer, that's a fantastic question. I haven't given it enough thought. I do think there's opportunity there, but I think where it lies is in these tools that get developed, right, by these external startups and 3Ps, and then fed into those larger corporations, which is kind of what we were doing at CVS. Like we'd look for vendors who could start supplying, the pods, although at the time they weren't that well developed and nobody could get through the HIPAA things. And now that a couple have, I think there's the means to do it. So I think it's going to be pharmaceutical companies and medical companies that are going to utilize those. And every healthcare company is going in that direction. I mean, I think I've had one non-virtual appointment with my doctor in the past 2 years.
Right. Interesting. I think we got time for a couple more questions. I want to read one to you I just got, which is kind of funny. It says, I can't believe in 2023 our catalogs are static images instead of interactive video. Does Mark have thoughts on the use of video, maybe even TikTok in catalogs?
Yeah, I won't go down the TikTok road in this conversation. But no, absolutely. I think that is where the virtual. I mean, if you think about the virtual, magic mirrors, where you can try on clothes, you can try on eyeglasses already on your computer, different eyeglasses, right? So I think that's a huge opportunity. And again, this is the how do you bring those ecosystems into existing businesses that allow them to interact with their customers? So I do think like web design and interactive web design, it's a game changer. I don't know if I answered the question. If I didn't, let me know.
You did. Let me ask you one last question. This is a complicated one, at least for me to get my head around, but it's basically around the involves the deprecation of third-party cookies and what's happening with privacy and Apple with changing their policies, and now GDPR, the changes happening with Android next year. But I mean, they're asking about Amazon, but let's put Amazon aside because I don't want to put you on the spot. I guess, how big of a problem do you think the elimination of third-party cookies is going to be for retail in the long term? And have you seen, are there interesting solutions that you've seen or you think are needed as third-party cookies get eliminated?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a challenge. And unfortunately, several companies drive that. I do think it's going to be a challenge. Yeah, I don't know a solution at this point. It's hard. It is, to your point, it's hard to wrap your head around it. I do think what's going to happen. I do think like Web3 and the metaverse is going to impact that, right? So like those two can't live together, right? And so if you're moving towards an open platform, which I think eventually we'll get to in several years, then you don't have that restriction, right? I think where like Web3 is gonna, I think it's gonna open a lot of doors for individuals and 3Ps, right, to sell product and whatever that product might be. Unfortunately, right now it's not product that's worth a lot, but I think it could be. So I do think like those two things are going to be diametrically opposed to each other, and I think as we get more of an open web, some of that might fall aside.
Yeah, interesting. Totally makes sense. Really interesting. All right, we're kind of at the bottom of the hour. David, are you any other questions?
I think, yeah, before we go, I just, we are kind of our audience really is kind of Israeli tech that would love to work with some big retailers. I guess my first question is what, from a retailer point of view, what would be considered enterprise ready? Obviously Amazon's not going to take on someone that hasn't tried and tested and proven themselves, capable, but what would be like the minimum barrier for an average company to say, it's baked enough for us to play with this?
I guess it depends on what it is and what the tech is.
Yeah.
I think like the bar would be just the level of testing and the level of customer interaction, right? And when I say customer, whether it's a public customer or private customer, and what what business benefit, like what are the economics around it? Because some tech, unfortunately, and we played a lot around this in both the CVS and Amazon, is that the tech might be great, but it might be just too expensive, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's you're paying, the astronomical surcharges you might have to pay, or just the integration of the technology into the existing systems. So I think that's one area where, like, if startups are going to larger companies, it's not only, okay, here's the technology, here's the benefit, here's what we've learned from potential customers or businesses in utilization, but then also what are the economics around it, and what does it take beyond what they've created, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it sounds like that it's not the economics also part is not just like the dollar figure, but it's how much time and effort you're gonna they're gonna have to invest in order to get it up and running,
yeah.
and to operate in the long term.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So even a 2 to 5 year plan on what that might look like is really helpful for businesses to wrap their heads around it.
Okay.
And it might be, and so a caveat, it might be just one aspect. So if you think about JWO technology, and I'm not saying anything out of context here, but JWO technology just allows retailers just huge throughput on product, right? If customers don't have to stop to pay for something, your throughput can quadruple on that product.
Right.
And so, it might be like that could be the business case for it. Now, it might be astronomically expensive, but then how over time do you drive those costs down while still enabling, that throughput or even greater throughput as you're reducing costs? So I think it's just like, where are those opportunities?
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's that kind of answers that question.
Cool. All right. Mark, we're going to let you go. We're at the bottom of the hour. This has been fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
It's been very interesting.
Thank you. Appreciate it, and hope we talk soon. And I'm happy to be able to chat with you guys and all the brilliant entrepreneurs that are on the call. So appreciate it.
We do have some questions in the chat if you're available to jump on the chat and answer them if you have time.
So let me just give you a last wrap up. Everyone, again, you've been listening to Mark Nitkey. He's a global innovation and design executive and friend of AGP, most recently head of store design at Amazon Fresh. I'm Scott from AGP Ventures. On behalf of myself and David Jahid in Israel, thanks again to Retail in Israel. Our next call, just so you know, in 2 weeks from today is with an executive in the Smart Building and Workspace Solutions Group at Lenovo. We're going to be talking about the future of work and smart buildings and a host of other topics. She's amazing. It's been a really interesting call. So that basically concludes this live stream. So thanks all for joining us. And until next time, thanks again.
Thank you.